Greta, this is the Greta Jane YouTube channel. Welcome back. Today, we are going to be talking about the physiology of the menstrual cycle. So let's get started. Understanding what's physiologically happening in our bodies helps us to understand our experience of what's happening. So before we get into the human experience side of the menstrual cycle, let's start with the miraculous physiological process going on inside of us women. Physiologically, the menstrual cycle is a woman's body preparing for a potential pregnancy. Cycle after cycle, your body is building an environment inside of you for new life to come forth. Kind of a big deal, right? We come into this cycle when we get our first period, which is called menarche. Some of us girls may be as young as 10 years old or as old as 16. Everyone has their different timing with it. It's kind of crazy, right? That at quite a young age, our bodies are taking on this really big job. Girls are pretty incredible. So the menstrual cycle is about 28 days long, but it can be a little longer or a little shorter. And it's made up of two main phases and two events that mark the start of each of these phases. So let's start from day one, which is menstruation, also known as your period. Menstruation is the event that marks the first phase of your menstrual cycle, which is the follicular phase. The follicular phase starts on day one of your menstrual cycle, which is the first day of your period, and it goes through to about day 14, which is ovulation. Ovulation is the second event that marks the second phase of your menstrual cycle, which is the luteal phase. Now, if you have a 28-day cycle, you likely ovulate on day 14, but the exact day you ovulate depends on the overall length of your cycle. But what you really need to know here is that the luteal phase begins with ovulation and it ends when your period starts again. So what's actually happening in these two phases that make up the menstrual cycle? So remember, the follicular phase starts with the event of menstruation, your period. In these beginning days of the follicular phase, the levels of the hormones estrogen and progesterone are low. And this is what results in the breakdown and shedding of the uterine lining, known as menstrual bleeding. And it's around this time that the pituitary gland, which is in your brain, begins sending follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, to the ovaries. And this is what stimulates the development of 5 to 20 follicles in the ovaries. Each of these follicles contain an immature egg, and each of them also produce the hormone estrogen. And one of these follicles will grow faster than the others. So out of the 5 to 20 follicles that have been developing, this follicle, the fastest growing follicle, will become the dominant follicle. And while this follicle is growing, levels of the hormone estrogen are rising in the blood. And this increase in estrogen does two major things. Number one, it inhibits or hinders the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. This starves the other follicles of follicle stimulating hormone, and it makes those smaller follicles die off. And number two, it makes the lining of your uterus thicken with nutrients and blood, which creates a nutrient-rich environment for a fertilized egg to grow if you were to get pregnant. Now we're moving into the luteal phase, which, remember, the luteal phase begins with the event of ovulation. And it starts with a rise in the levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. The rise in the levels of luteinizing hormone tells one of the most prominent follicles, the dominant follicle, to burst open and release the egg it's been holding. And this is the event of ovulation, the release of the egg from the follicle. From here, the egg heads into the fallopian tube and begins its trip to the uterus. Now, once this event of ovulation has taken place, the levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone decrease. And meanwhile, back in the ovaries, that follicle that burst open or ruptured to release that egg at ovulation now closes, and it forms a structure called a corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine gland that produces the hormones estrogen and progesterone, both of which cause the lining of your uterus to thicken even more. And right now we're talking about the menstrual cycle and not what happens when you get pregnant. So if no pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum will break down somewhere between 9 to 11 days after ovulation. The breakdown of the corpus luteum results in a drop in both the levels of estrogen and progesterone, which brings us back to menstruation, which would also bring us back to the first phase of the menstrual cycle, which is the follicular phase. Okay, so that is the whole menstrual cycle. So let's go through a super quick rundown of everything that I just said. The menstrual cycle has two main phases, each marked by a key event. The first phase of the menstrual cycle is the follicular phase. It begins with the event of menstruation, and it's the phase where follicles containing eggs in the ovaries develop. The second phase of the menstrual cycle is the luteal phase, and it begins when the most dominant of these follicles pops open and releases its egg, and this is the event of ovulation. A corpus luteum forms from the follicle that released its egg, the lining of the uterus thickens, and if no pregnancy has occurred, the corpus luteum breaks down, the period starts, and the menstrual cycle begins again. I have a fun fact here for you. The average woman will have 450 periods in her lifetime. So that means going through this entire cycle 450 times. All of that to say, it truly does hold a lot of significance and deeper meaning. Remember, this video has been all about the physiological process of the menstrual cycle in your body, meaning what it is your reproductive organs and reproductive system is physiologically doing. There's also what you experience in each of these phases, which is probably the most relevant thing for us to learn and understand. And you may come to the end of this video. If you've watched this far, thank you so much. Please comment a red rose if you've come this far. You might be asking yourself at this point in the video, does what's happening in my reproductive system actually have anything to do with me? Yes, it most definitely does. You will come to see that it actually has a whole lot to do with a bunch of different parts of you. And we will be getting into what the menstrual cycle really means to us in our human experience of it very soon. And so before you head off, I hope that you will subscribe so that the next time a video from me comes in, you'll be ready to learn a little bit more about you. Like this video to support growing the knowledge of the menstrual cycle, and leave me a comment because I would love to hear from you. From the growing light in me to the growing light in you, thank you, and I will see you next time.